Good morning, and we welcome you back to the Development Dialogue, Bridging Voices. And we hope that yesterday you had a wonderful conference day, had a good night's rest, and that now we can start fresh. We also would like to welcome our colleagues from the City Conference who also join us today. Yesterday, we have one panel that runs parallel with our Development Dialogue panel, and that was part of the City Conference. And this conference is, this part of the conference, Development Dialogue Conference, is also a part where the people from City Conference are going to join us. So now we are going to start our second day of Development Dialogue Bridging Voices. And I would like to invite, the names. Juan David Parra, from ISS PhD community to open our conference today. Juan David is part of the core organizing committee of this 2013 Development Dialogue. But the reason he is chosen to speak today is also because he's one of our PhD researchers who try to bridge voices. He started as an economist and then tried to look at sociology approaches, and maybe after this he would go somewhere else. Juan David, please, the time is yours.
Okay, I wrote something, so I'm going to read it. Okay, dear members of the main panel, Dr. Katherine Walsh, Drs. John Cameron and Dr. Rosalba Icaza from the International Institute of Social Studies. Dear members of the staff, colleagues, and friends. On behalf of the ISS PhD community, I would like to welcome you all to the second day of the 11th edition of the Development Dialogue. As a community, we are proud of what has been done here. This is not only the result of an enormous effort in terms of logistics and organization, but it's also part of the materialization of one belief that is shared by the majority of us. The belief that the study of development as a discipline cannot subordinate the subject of the study, human beings, to a single scientific paradigm. Society is much more complex than that. I would like to use these words to reflect upon the idea of bridging voices, the reasons behind the selection of this concept as the main topic of this conference, and some personal thoughts regarding the need of an interdisciplinary dialogue between scholars, governments, and civil society. Some of you might legitimately and literally jump from the chairs and ask me, well, but what do you understand by academy, government, and civil society? For the time being, I will respond that they are powerful actors, all with pre-established agendas, but who need to interact with each other in order to defend some vested interests. And therefore, the need for a dialogue is still open. The understanding of bridging voices includes three analytical levels. The first one rests upon ontology and epistemology, or the way in which we define what can be understood about the world and how can we understand it. The dialogue between scholars should serve as a means to challenge assumptions about the functioning of the social world, and this is the only way to take a step forward. The second level is political, meaning with it the dimension in which the interests of multiple actors, including scholars and politicians, are being favored, for example, by one dominant research agenda. In this case, dialogue should help to foster empathy, as actors can become more aware of the usefulness of different points of view and the way they can contribute to strengthen their own view and understanding of the world. The third level is, if you allow me to say so, practical. We need some agreements to fight common concerns as poverty and inequality. And although there might be many ways to conceive public policy, there are multiple expectations to be met. In the end, something has to be done. However, with the latter, I would not like to favor any radical scenarios of complete and non-reflexive academic openness. Here, I would like to quote Albert Einstein with a phrase that welcomes visitors in the entrance of one of the offices of development and change, one of ISS academic journals. By academic freedom, I understand the right to search for truth and to publish and teach what one holds to be true. This right implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true. It is evident that any restriction on academic freedom acts in such a way as to hamper the dissemination of knowledge among people and thereby impedes national judgment and action. Reflexivity is essential. Before pretending to unfold what we might believe is true, as scholars, we do have to accept who we are and where do we come from. This will not only condition our definition of what's real, and hence help us to be transparent with our readers, but will give us internal consistency. We have an ethical duty to be honest and consistent with our own principles and beliefs. And bridging voices should serve and bridging voices should serve also to contribute to this goal. Academic openness and the idea of interdisciplinarity demands internally consistent and reflective actors, dialoguing and also being reflexive about each other's philosophical, methodological, analytical grounds. This will also allow the possibility of contestation. An academy without contestation, well, becomes almost religion. We are deeply grateful for all of you being here helping us to make this project become real. We are also being reflexive, and therefore we invite you all to help us to identify possible weaknesses and strengths of the event, so we can keep learning on how to make the idea of bridging voices become more fluent and sustainable. Our mailboxes are open, and so are we, if you see us walking around. Please enjoy the rest of the day, and don't forget to listen, to question, to doubt, to challenge, and, when possible, to make your own contributions to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan David. Now let me introduce you to our keynote speaker for today. For those who are not here yesterday, Dr. Catherine Walsh is an activist, intellectual, long engaged in the struggles for social justice, first in the United States and in the last 20 years in Ecuador and Latin America, where she has worked collaboratively with indigenous and Afro-descendant social movements. She was an unofficial advisor to Ecuador's 2008 Constitutional Assembly and has been involved in initiatives and debates throughout the Andes and the Americas on decolonization and transformation, including of the models of knowledge, development, society, and state. Catherine's present work is focused on the political, epistemic, and ethical project of critical interculturality on concerns of decoloniality, particularly with regard to the interrelated themes of race, gender, knowledge, and nature, and on social-political pedagogies of resistance, insurgency, and existence otherwise. Her extensive list of books and articles published in Latin America, North America, and Europe across the fields of critical development studies, social and human sciences, cultural studies, education, and law. Catherine is presently Senior Professor and Director of the Doctoral Program in Latin American Cultural Studies at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolivar in Ecuador and Visiting Professor in Roman Studies at Duke University. Dr. Catherine Walsh, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the organizers of this event, to Chi, particularly, who did lots of work to bring all this together, to Tamara, to Juan David's comments a few moments ago, to Angelica, and to the entire organizing committee of graduate students. I know to put something like this together is not easy. It takes lots of collective effort together. and to open a space of true dialogue that crosses difference, I think is a real challenge. And so I want to commend you for taking that effort to do that. I also want to thank John for his comments yesterday, because I think he gave a good opening which to continue the dialogue today. And so what I want to do is challenge us a little bit more, to depart from some things that John mentioned yesterday, and to begin to think about the bridges, the different kinds of bridges, the bridgings and the crossings that they entail, and maybe even the crossroads they open up. So, as John said yesterday, to play with the metaphor of bridge is also what I had in mind, and I think we're going to be somewhat connected on that terrain. But also to think about, for all of you present, the bridges that you might call your own. So what I wanted to do is, before I start my talking, to ask a few of you to reflect. When you think about bridges, what are you thinking about? What are the bridges that you recall, that you construct, that you imagine with reference to this space? I don't know if I can. So I want to sort of start in a participatory way, and so I'm not the center of attention here. So I don't know if some of the graduate students that have participated in this would like to say something about the bridges you're thinking about. Angelica.
Just words. I think fear, freedom.
Connection, integrity.
Yeah, yesterday I was just thinking about the need for this bridge. Who needs it? And is it supplied or is it demanded? And how do we know about that need? What determines the direction in which we are going? And I think that was missing yesterday.
The bridge between what is practical, but what it's also effective in terms of public policy, for example.
Someone else? You're all still tired.
For me, the question is also who built the bridge, and who gets the credit.
Yeah, to me it's a bridge, the bridge that now many countries are opening, and like yesterday people were saying, in the name like development. We have to think that also in the name of development nowadays, many bridges are only built one way. Please think about the possibility to help the people at the other side. That name, that development means it's quite scary, can be, because globalization is bringing all these bridges one way. Yesterday when I was here and I hear somebody saying that she studied here and she went back to her country and she didn't know what to do, and she went back to study. That's a very incredible luxury, is that, because after being in this kind of schools where your imaginations, like Cameron was saying yesterday, to build a different kind of bridge with all the tools that you get here. I mean, at your country where you're coming from, seeing all this beautiful diversity that is here, please help your country, because they need it. They really need it. Try to build a bridge also this way, not only Western to your country. try to bring and if it's not exist, try to create one that is a new, with new materials, new way of thinking, that will help so much both ways, those kind of bridge.
One more and then I guess I'll have to talk.
Thank you. For me, I think of a bridge as a knowledge production and the relevance of this knowledge and its practicability to solve human problems, poverty, inequality, unemployment. You know, that's what I think of a bridge.
Okay.
Thank you. Just 2 months ago, I was thinking about bridges in times of wars, and history showed that bridges were destroyed in times of wars to harm the enemy, to harm the civic. And so in that sense, building bridges for me means peace as well.
Bridges projects, both concrete projects and intellectual projects, and also all manipulations, corruptions, hidden interest behind the project of building bridges.
Bridges have place, right? That they can be metaphors, as John mentioned yesterday, but they happen in a place. And so those histories, those places, those localizations are points of departure. And I think to make those present here, the different places that are present here, the different localizations are important. That bridges can be positive, but bridges can be negative, right? So to begin to put some of those things on the table as a first point of entry, I thought is important in establishing a dialogue. But what I want to sort of propose is for me to go posing, provoking, reflecting on certain elements that come to mind for me when I think about bridges, bridging, but also this notion of development. And what kinds of crossings are we making? Are they colonial? Are they crossings that open up decolonial possibilities or horizons, and what do we mean by that? Right? So to be a little bit more reflective about the possibilities, but also sometimes the obstacles and problems of bridges themselves. So by doing that, I also want to challenge you or provoke discussion in the process. So let's not think about this sort of as a traditional keynote with me talking and you quiet, but rather I would prefer if we can engage along the process. So if something that I say sparks an interest or a question or attention, let's put it out there and see how we can sort of build this conversation together. I think that's what the students had in mind when they posed this dialogue. So that's what I want to try and do. First, I thought it might be helpful to think a little bit about place and location. To think about the bridges in and place that we've just heard folks reflect on, but also the places and localizations here. Academia, most of the time, tells us not to name place, right? To think in this universal sense. Not to identify, to name, to make present our places of thought. The places that we think from. In fact, we know, in the name of objectivity, neutrality, right? It requires us to forget place, to forget where we came from, to begin to establish some kind of universal, right? That's theory, that's knowledge, that's what you study in the academy. So when you go back to place, it's to do a case study, right, for your dissertations, is to look at some objects of study, maybe even mention your own subjectivity, but always to come back to that universal space of theory, right, of analysis. And so I think the tensions around place are important ones to put on the table. But also, as a Colombian friend and colleague, Santiago Castro Gomez, talks about, there's this 0 point. So if I stand on the chair, I'll probably get yelled at. But it's almost like if you stand up and you look down, right? And so that's how observation, analysis oftentimes happens in the academy. Don't take a picture, I'll get yelled at later. But this idea that researchers are somehow above, right? And that's, as Santiago says, is this 0 point, right? That gives you neutrality and distance. And so what happens even for many of you present, when you may go back to your home countries or communities to so-called study and do research, and all of a sudden you're not the same person because you're now in the academy, so that you're supposed to maintain some neutrality, distance, and oftentimes people look at you a different way, right? So those kinds of things are important, I think, to take into account. But there's also this notion of sentiment, passion, and involvement. We're told in the academy, you're not supposed to be passionate, right? That's a sign of weakness. You're not supposed to be involved. Take distance, right? How can you analyze something if you're too close to it? So you shouldn't analyze your own community. You could analyze neighboring communities, maybe. But you shouldn't analyze your own because you're part of it, right? So those kinds of things that we internalize, that we're taught to believe are true, take away place, right? Or make place this kind of bad word where sentiment, passion, involvement aren't any more neutral places to work from. Unfortunately, this has never worked for me. I've never been able to hide my passion or involvement, nor have I ever been neutral. And I don't hide that. And in fact, and as I'll explain in a moment, in having one foot in the academy and one foot out all the time, I've always been very clear that I believe and I put on the table what I believe and that I feel it. And so I think those kinds of things oftentimes that are associated with women, that we're more passionate, we're more involved, and somehow we're less rational, is a problem that the academy teaches us we're supposed to overcome. So for women to move up in the academic scale, leave behind your passion, leave behind your involvement. It's okay to nurture, right, to help your graduate students. But you have to become neutral and distant and objective and forget your place, forget your gender, forget your body embodiment. And so I think those are kinds of things that we're beginning to challenge here and put on the table. But of course, in the more than 40 years since I first entered university as a graduate, as a student, an undergraduate student then, and the more than 30 years that I've been trying to learn how to unform or deform that formation that was put on me, I've begun to identify a space. And I think about that space as the cracks, as sort of the fissures, about what it means to work within the cracks, right? So that we might say that in a world permeated still by this notion of modern rationality, that we know at the same time is always colonial, because the colonial didn't end. It continues to reproduce itself in different ways, including with regards to knowledge, about how those cracks can be part of our own places and localizations. And so I think that's interesting to think about too, also with the idea of bridges. Because bridges are oftentimes very linear, right? They take you from one space to another. But what are those kinds of cracks that grow? Maybe in the edges or frames of the bridges, but even in the pavement or the ground itself. And how do we find spaces within there? How do we open up those cracks and fissures a little bit more? So I think those are part of some of the challenges that we need to begin to think about. As Tamara mentioned when she introduced me, I identify or I think of myself as an activist and intellectual, a militant intellectual, an intellectual activist, but always a combination of those two. I don't think of myself or describe myself as an academic, although I happen to work in academic settings. What does that mean? My place of being, of thought, of thinking, of struggle has been on the streets, in the courts. I work in the law field as well, in public policy, in social institutions, but also in the university. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that the university itself is also a place of building bridges, yes, but it's also a place of struggle, right? To begin to make present other voices, other thinking, other bodies, other ways of being and creating thought, which oftentimes we're encouraged not to do. But to name our place, our localization in place of thought, of enunciation, of acting and in being, essential to what the Afro-Colombian intellectual thinker, now passed to the other side, Manuel Zapata Olivella, talked about, the chains that are still on our minds. So I think to begin to move those chains a little bit is maybe part of the way to begin to take a step away from this Western modernity, Western rationality as universal, as the only way of thought, of the steel bridges, right? And to begin to think about other kinds of bridges. So we can ask, from our localizations and places, how do we conceive, imagine bridges? Bridges for what? To connect, to cross over, and then just simply to cross back. So the bridges of lights, very close here in Amsterdam. The bridge in front of ISS that people cross over every day without thinking probably. But also those other kinds of bridges that maybe don't have so clear their paths and where they're going to. But also to think about the bridges that are somehow woven together. In the Andes, Incan and pre-Incan bridges were built with materials from nature, with fibers from trees, from plants, with rocks, with wood, but where nature became part of the bridge building, which is pretty different to think about the steel bridges or the modern bridges of today. But the Spanish chroniclers wrote about these bridges, the pre-Incan and Incan bridges, as sophisticated technology. That's something that they didn't quite understand when they arrived, right? So if we think about today, how we think about technology comes from the global north, not from the global south, and how the very art of building bridges and bridges that are part and done with nature was something that the Spanish had a hard time understanding. So this makes me think about bridges that move, that aren't necessarily stable. Part of these bridges built with fiber, right? Move with nature, move with the wind, move with the movement of people, move with the environment, and they're not stable. But that makes me think of other bridges too. Bridges that are collapsible, that are portable. What some Puerto Rican communities in the United States call that aerial bridge that goes between Puerto Rico and the US, Puerto Rico being still a colony of the US, and Puerto Ricans being US citizens, although considered second-class citizens still. And so oftentimes, metaphorically, people refer to the aerial bridge of going back and forth all the time. And I'm sure many of you may feel that same kind of movement. So I think it goes back to some of the questions that all of you raised in the beginning. Bridges conceived and constructed by whom? Bridges for what? For what purposes? What connections? What passages and crossing? But including and related as well to research. So we can sort of think about the bridges that simply function to sustain the adventures and the free fall of development work and research, like bungee jumping bridges, which in a sense, you jump in and then you're pulled back to a safe place. So let me move on a little bit and think about how these bridges and bridgings begin to help us, or maybe make more complicated, the issue of development, right? The other theme of the event here, and obviously in a place like ISS with development studies, which is pretty key. So the developments, but also the envelopments of developments, and the kinds of crossings that occur, and the bridges that maybe take us beyond. But in that sense, I think it's important to begin to think about those first crossings, where the sword, the Bible, the cross, right, became tools of Western civilization to bring to those somehow supposedly non-civilized, right? From the north to the south, the north understood in today's terms as the West, right? Those crossings that had, as we know, an intention that wasn't just to so-called civilize, but was also to control, to begin to bring development in order to take away natural resources, to begin to establish the model of capitalism, which we know began in the very colonial endeavor. But today, we can ask if those first crossings, very colonial, obviously, in nature and intent, have somehow changed in the development world. The new Western, and particularly European crossings in Latin America today, in South America in particular, but in Latin America in general, or what I prefer to call Abayala. And maybe I should say a couple of words about what Abayala signifies. If we understand that Latin America was a name imposed, right, that the peoples, the nations that lived on that territory before the arrival of the Spanish, or in Brazil, the Portuguese, didn't use the word Latin America. That's an imposed name from outside. So today, and basically since 1992, the celebration, recognition of the problematics of 500 years of resistance, that native peoples throughout the Americas began to talk about Abayala, which is a Kuna word from Panama, which means land in full maturity, which has a very different significance than an imposed name like Latin America. So many people today in the region, indigenous people, but non-indigenous people as well, prefer, as do I, to call the region Abayala and not Latin America. So if we think about development today, there's this new kind of alternative development discourse that comes from Europe that's particularly present in this region. One can say that it's begun to focus on other things, to reduce poverty, to address social equality, and to address the issue of climate change, environment. Alternative developments and reforms of development itself, right? And I put the slash in there of reform because we might say it's reforming the same, forming again the same thing, right? But it's being thought of more and more as an alternative to what development was before, right? So there's actually two aims that are present all through South America, particularly today. And one has to do with what's being called integral human development, right? This notion that we can improve the quality of individual and social life through issues like equity, democracy, protection of natural resources, and respect for ethnic cultural diversity. It's the aim of UNESCO, of the UNDP, and of this organization that's called Aerosocial, with AL at the end for America Latina, right? And its aims are inclusion, social cohesion, and diversity management. Now, recently, about a year or so ago, I was having a conversation with an organization of Afro-descendant women from throughout the Americas that received funding from Aerosocial. And they were told in their projects they had to include social cohesion. But nobody knew what social cohesion meant, right? And the Italian woman who was heading up the Aerosocial effort kept telling him, no, just keep doing what you're doing, it's fine. And so we were having this discussion about social cohesion. And one of the women participants in the organization said, isn't that a way to somehow pacify our resistance, our struggles? So if one thinks about it, and this is particularly true as well with indigenous populations today and indigenous movements, that sometimes this notion of integral human development and the way that's been used by state governments too, is to pacify, to get everybody to get along, supposedly, so that they will no longer struggle, resist, and there won't be conflict. So one can ask, this notion of integral human development, what kind of alternative is it? And an alternative for who? And if these new crossings from Europe to the South don't also work to take away the struggles, historic struggles and the present day struggles against peoples, against states, but also bringing up this new notion of what it means to be a universal citizen. The other is sustainable development, right, where the focus is really much more on environmental, economic, and socio-political sustainability. But what's interesting is European Aid's webpage says, and I put the quote there, regional cooperation represents a privileged tool to share with Latin America partners experience and know-how, the know-how of Europe as a region, the experience in Latin America. So if we remember that woven bridge where the Spanish chroniclers said there's a high level of sophisticated technology here of knowledge, and today still the belief is that knowledge is created in the North, in Europe, and there's experience in Latin America. So what are the different ways of thinking about development that are emerging from the South? In Ecuador, in Bolivia, we talk about the notion of living well, of buen vivir, of vivir bien, of suma causa in Quechua, as a new crossing from the South that's not just thought for the South itself, and I think this is important to think about, that Ecuador recently passed its second plan of buen vivir. The first one happened recently after the Constitution. The second one is 2013 to 2017. And it has 4 principles that I think is interesting to help us think a little bit about the bridges and the crossings that we can think about with not development per se, but with alternatives to development, something that Arturo Escobar talks about a lot. If you've taken Rosalba's class about post-development, you've read that and thought about that. But I think it's important to think about the difference between development alternatives, alternative to development. And in this sense, there's 4 principles in consideration. One is from Andean cosmology, indigenous knowledges, and the relation of humans and nature, which is integral. The second has to do with Western traditions of critical dominant modernity, of alternative ethics, of feminisms, of deep ecology, etc. In other words, there's a new building in place that begins to start from the South and from knowledges and ways of thinking, but begins to also connect with the North, which I think is real different oftentimes when we think about the North thinks they know what's best for the South, but how the South is creating something that doesn't deny the North. With notions of socialism in a different sense, of socialism of living well, but also with principles of liberalism. So it's not a negating of westernization, which is very much present in the region, but it's how does one begin to move those crossings and build different bridges. So the bridges starting from the south, not starting from the north. And how does that change the term of the conversation? So, in essence, it's beginning to think from the south and its perspective and know-how, which is quite different than Europe AIDS issue. But there's also this going on of a bridging of radically distinct logics. And the case of Saryaku, which Jackie's working on, and she knows very well, is an important one. But we were talking about earlier the case of Saramaka in Suriname, which is a similar one. And so how, for example, in the case of Saryaku, where the Inter-American Court of Human Rights decided in favor of Quechua people against the state of Ecuador and its attempted exploration of oil. But what's interesting in the decision of the case, and I encourage you, for those of you who are interested in public policy and law, to look at this, about how the Inter-American Court said, we have to think about a different notion of rights that don't start from individuals, that don't even start from peoples per se, but that start from other ways of living and being in the world, of being and living with nature. The recognition of collective, integral, and vital sense of territory, cosmology, spirituality, and cultural identity, all intertwined. And the ways that ancestral law can inform Western law. Was a very, again, shifting, a bridging from south to north, but there's actually changing the way that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights thinks about law itself. But there's also in the Constitution of Ecuador a thinking of nature. So Ecuador is the first constitution in the world to name nature as the subject of rights, right? Nature, understood as Pachamama or Mother Earth, where life is materialized and reproduced, has the right to an integral respect of its existence and the right to the maintenance and regeneration, the right to reparation, right? So that, again, is a challenge not for Ecuador, it's a challenge to the world. And that challenge is being taken up. Again, bridges from the south to the north. In the United States today, nature and people are being considered not as corporate power, which in fact in the United States since 1886 and is still law today, corporate organizations, companies have people power. In other words, corporations are considered as individuals with rights. So over 30 different municipal ordinances in the United States have taken into account the rights of nature and have said, we're following the example of Ecuador. So what happens when we begin to shift the direction of the bridges and the crossings? When the South is offering lessons to the North? I think that's very different than the ways that the bridges have typically been built. But there's another issue here. The kind of bridges that are being built by so-called progressive governments and the invasive crossings that are occurring, despite what I just mentioned. So the role today of developmentalist extractivisms, a new way to understand development, is in debate and discussion, of agribusiness and the new places of technology, science, and knowledge. And let's look quickly at this. So the crossings of past, present, maybe have not changed a whole lot. If one looks at this map, both of gas, oil, mining, and agribusiness, just in South America. If you can sort of see from a distance here, the red dots are gas exploration. The triangles are mines. So if one looks from Argentina all the way up the coast, particularly in Peru, where mining has been centered, but also now in Ecuador, Colombia, how it's beginning to grow and move. And the squares are oil exploration and exploitation. But what's interesting to think about here on the map too is that there's different configurations and new bridgings between countries. So Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela are sort of known sometimes in the Western world as the new radical progressive governments, right? Argentina, Brazil are what are sometimes called left-tending governments. Chile before the current president. And of course, Colombia is out of the picture. And we might say similar to Peru. But those different kinds of things that we can begin to see on the map are also the different relationships and constructions. So here in the green are soy cultivations. Monsanto, which here in the Netherlands you know a lot about. So begin now in the progressive states to talk about a new kind of developmentalism, right? So if we recall, the Constitution of Ecuador, the Constitution and the laws in Bolivia that talk about nature as a subject of rights, right? That begin to talk about buen vivir, living well, as this new paradigm that goes beyond development. But now governments, progressive governments, are talking directly and calling it by name as developmentalist extractivism. The kind of extractivism that's necessary to eradicate poverty and supposedly make the distinction to a different social model, saying that more extractivism is necessary to get out of extractivism. So the issue no longer is sort of the politically good states against the politically bad states, but rather how within progressive politics today, right, the issue of extractivism is becoming key. So we see a new role of the state, rethinking of the state in a different way with nationalizing of companies, establishing new public-private societies, redistributing earnings to communities themselves, but also the role of the BRIC countries, particularly of China. It's interesting to note that Ecuador is #1 in all of Latin America in terms of Chinese financing, and is primarily for extractivism. And Brazil is one of the major financiers of hydroelectric plants, dams, highways from the Amazon to the Pacific coast, etc. But at the same time, there's a role to delegitimize, to repress, to co-opt, criminalize, and silence social resistance. So in every single country on that first map that we just saw, resistance today is being criminalized. In Peru, we know there's thousands, several thousand people criminalized in prison or with threats of criminalization. In Ecuador, the same thing. In Bolivia, the same thing, right? So being progressive government does not mean that somehow people are part of the government processes. But that kind of criminalization and silencing of social resistance also makes it very hard to think about bridges, to think about bridgings and voices and new constructions when government itself is repressing that. The fact that women are the majority of those repressed, silenced, and in fact violated in this process is also important to think about. But there's also this other discussion going on. So progressive governments say that we have to hold the transnationals responsible. So the problem now is not as before where transnational companies could come in and exploit. Now it's nationally controlled, and companies like Chevron that dumped $18 billion of gallons of toxic waste in the Amazon and were found guilty in 2011 and ordered to pay $19 billion. Just recently, approximately a month ago, here in the very Hague, an arbitration court decided in favor of the company. So what's interesting here, and I want to connect this again to the notion of bridges and crossings, is Ecuador's president, Rafael Correa, with his hand covered with oil, the oil that's still in the ground in the Amazon, started a campaign that's called the Dirty Hand of Chevron, right? Where we have protests, the picture here is in the United States, protests all over the world, supporting Ecuador's struggle against oil exploitation, against the decision of The Hague. All the while, new alliances and new bridges are being built with Chevron in Argentina. But we also have the case of Yasuni. Many of you have probably heard of Yasuni, right? Ecuador's Yasuni initiative was designed to keep oil in the ground, to think about the possibility of a post-extractivist, post-oil era, right? Asked so-called developed countries to contribute to keeping oil in the ground. But just recently, just several weeks ago, Ecuador's president decided to end the initiative because he didn't get the money supposedly necessary, and so now we will exploit the oil. In this region, there's two uncontacted groups, indigenous nations, peoples, by choice, non-contacted. But what's interesting to think from this, sort of the contradiction and the tension between the campaign against Chevron and the exploitation of oil in Yasuni. But what this has done is begin to build new bridges amongst youth. So today in Ecuador, and connected to other youth groups in the region, there's an increasingly awareness of struggle that's using the notion of Yasuni to unite and to protest in very creative and different ways. So one can say that despite the problems of extractivism, new ways of protesting are emerging that are important to think about with groups that typically did not have contact together before. And the final thing that I want to mention here is the role of agribusiness. So here we can see what's being called the new United Republic of Soy that connects on the map Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, and parts of Brazil, where the company, Syngenta, who, by the way, the head of is a Swiss, most of the members of the board are Swiss or European, is looking at new ways to connect the countries. So what are the bridges being built between countries that on the one side, for example, are thinking about these new alliances of progressive governments, a new mapping of UNASUR, the United Nations of South America, but also the new ways to bring countries together based on extractivism, agribusiness, etc., the development paradigms that many of you are probably studying in your own work. What's interesting here is those new borders and bridges being built between nation states, defined by the objective of agribusiness in this case, but also, as Syngenta put up on their website, a new flag, right, that has the soy seed on it, proposing that no longer do we need the flags of Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, but that soy will connect. But the same thing happens with science technology. In Ecuador, this is the plan for new, what's called the City of Knowledge being built with Korean and Chinese financing, where Ecuador will now be able to export knowledge, to build bridges and crossings to other places based on knowledge, right? Interestingly built on ancestral lands, on indigenous and Afro-descendant lands, lands taken by the government to build this new city of knowledge. But also, as an announcement in Madrid's newspaper El País, just in July, announced, the government of Ecuador is offering 500 positions, maybe the Netherlands will be next on the list, besides Spain, to Spanish university professors willing to teach in our new National University of Education. Not a bad salary, $2,000 to $5,000 a month. You get a transportation allowance, food allowance, housing allowance. But as the Subsecretary of Education and Professional Development said, Spain is the first country we're going to offer this to because we have something in common. We have a common language, but we also have a common shared history. So the idea today is that Spanish professors will be coming to teach, buen vivir, to teach how to live well. And we can ask whether the colonial crossings are being revisited, whether the bridges of the past are being rebuilt, but now on different terms, because it's Ecuador offering Spain and Spanish professors to come in. So maybe Netherlands will be offered next. So all this brings me to some of the end reflections. What are the intellectual challenges, the decolonial crossings and the crossroads, and what does all this suggest in terms of our conversation here? Well, first, I want to go back to the importance of localization and place, right? For me, as an intellectual activist, concerned with how to transgress, to interrupt the still present colonial matrix of power. I mean, as we've seen, it hasn't gone away, it keeps repeating itself. The issue is increasingly how to work, to think from, and to open up those fissures and cracks that I mentioned in the beginning. Fissures and cracks increasingly present and evident in the colonial order, in the universalized model of Western civilization, but to build bridges from the cracks, from the movement and not the solid ground. So if we think about bridges, typically they're built on solid ground. But what happens when we think about bridges within the movement, within the contradictions? Movement, I'm not talking about social movement, I'm talking about the movement back and forth, right? To understand, despite the contradictions, despite the new forms of domination and repression that are emerging, how do we work within that? How do we begin to think with others, with peoples and places that are endeavoring to do the same? So to think from these experiences that I've shared with you from South America, but to think from the other places where the bridges that you've spoken about that challenge the bridges from the north. To think about resistance, but to also think about insurgents. And also to think about how one moves in increasingly difficult space with repression and silencing, which is true for us even now in some Latin American countries and universities, where we're being told not to speak out. But it also brings us to the issue, the second issue of development, right? So the shifting notion of development in South America today doesn't negate Europe. It doesn't negate the West, but somehow begins to make more clearly evident the significance, the importance of place. Of the place from where we depart, which side of the bridge one is on, and from where, how, and why to cross. To begin to challenge, for all of us here, not to make South America the object of study, which typically happens in academia, right? But to more critically consider what South America can teach us about development today, and more specifically about our own places and localizations, the here in this room present. But to also think about the bridges, the bridgings and the crossings. So while bridges, metaphorical, as John mentioned yesterday, or real, permit and enable connections, conversations and visits that without the bridges probably wouldn't have occurred. But are the bridges themselves enough? Especially when they can easily take us back, right? And not just move us forward. One can cross the bridge, but run back again. So maybe the problem of the bridge itself, in part, is because it's linear. It's linearity. So how do we begin to think, maybe in different ways, about crossings? And so I wanted to finish the reflections with this quote of Jackie Alexander, a Caribbean woman who works in Canada, who says, "The crossing is also meant to evoke and invoke the crossroads. The place where we put down and discard the unnecessary in order to pick up that which is necessary. The imaginary from which we dream the craft of a new compass." So I think that brings us to a different place. If the bridge or a crossing takes us to one place. The crossroads oftentimes includes confusion, fear, not knowing which direction to go in, but also affords a new space of of that in-between intercrossing, of inter-epistemic work, of thinking with others, with other knowledges, with other places, of interculturalizations, but also interversalizations that take us beyond the universal and connect different ways of thinking about being, thinking, acting, producing in the world. So inter-universalizations as a new space. But it also makes us to think about, too, what is the decolonial? The decolonial is not simply a theoretical paradigm or mode to assume, but it's part of the very action that we take in the ways that we position ourselves, in the ways that we intentionally make crossings, look for crossroads, and don't use those one-sided bridges to destroy, disenable the steel bridges, and maybe to take up those woven bridges that allow us to move, that allow us to connect in different ways, and allow us to come to a different place, which I think is a challenge that all of you face here, in a place that calls itself social studies, development studies, and that, as you have all mentioned, endeavors to do something in a more critical way. So to me, the decolonial is that. It's about taking a stance. It's about understanding how the colonial continues to reproduce itself, and to assume within our own work how we begin to open up decolonial crossings and decolonial horizons. So with that, I will end, and let's open it up for more debate and discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. Next, we would have an open discussion with Dr. Catherine Walsh, Dr. John Cameron, who was our keynote speaker yesterday, and Dr. Rosalba Icaza. Dr. John Cameron and Dr. Rosalba Icaza are both from the ISS. And for this open discussion, I will give the floor to Angelica Maria, who will facilitate this open discussion. For those who were not here yesterday, those who just arrived today, part of the city conference, you are very welcome to engage in this open discussion. Please, Angelica.